authenticity as an individual concern in modern culture, something that shapes the way that we express ourselves through things like art and music and cuisine. Now, that's often the way we tend to think about the influence of modernity. When we think about the modern world, we ask, how does it affect us as individuals? How does it make us feel? How does it make us behave? When we seek authenticity, where do we look for it and why? But the search for authenticity isn't something we always do as individuals. The need for something real, the need to connect to an objective reality, is something we often do in the company of other people and groups. And sometimes the group is united around that quest for reality. Religious groups, for example, are often built on a common quest for some ultimate knowledge about the universe. In other cases, the group itself is the reality. Ethnic groups and nationalist movements, for example, often see themselves as the primordial reality that makes sense of the universe. Groups like this have become increasingly important in modern societies, especially as the kinship and local identities that used to dominate human consciousness have eroded. And this means that if we want to understand the importance of authenticity in modern societies, we have to look at it as a social phenomenon, not just as a question of individual psychology. Now, one place you can see this is in nationalism. Nationalism, in its simplest sense, refers to the desire to create a nation around a specific group of people. But in most cases, nationalism involves a very specific sense of what that group is. The idea of a nation involves not just people, but a people, a group that's related to one another in much the same way as an ethnic group. Nationalist movements speak of the American people, or the English people, or the French people, or the Italian people, or the Russian people. In most cases, they have a series of primordial associations that they see all these people holding in common. A German is someone who speaks German, who comes from one of the German lands, who's descended from German ancestors. In a lot of cases, there's a religious requirement as well, in which some religions are seen as authentic religions, and others are foreign imports. The Hindu nationalist movements in India, for example, often referred to as Hindutva, have called for the expulsion of Islam, Christianity, and other foreign religions in favor of the true, authentic religion of Hinduism. Now, what all these characteristics have in common is the feeling of authenticity, the feeling that they imply a sort of deep-rootedness that can't be made up. Now, looking at the nation this way has some real advantages for modern states, not just because it makes individuals feel good, but because it gives the state a claim on its people. Now, the government of the modern state, after all, is usually pretty distant from the people it's governing. Here we are, up in Plattsburgh, way up in the North Country, surrounded by moose and mountains and maple syrup, while the government is run way down in Washington, D.C., 1,000 miles away from us. Most of us don't go to Washington very often, if at all. Most of us don't speak like the people in Washington. We don't necessarily trust the people in Washington. We might not even like the people in Washington. So the question naturally arises, why should we do what the people in Washington tell us to? Now, of course, there are reasons for it, including the fact that we have a representative democracy here in the United States. So the people in Washington are people whom we sent there, right? But imagine for a moment a society in which that isn't the case. Imagine a society in which everyday people don't have much of a voice in the government. Imagine a society where the capital is not only a long distance away, but it's culturally very different from you. So different that you don't feel like you have any connection to the people there. Why would you pay taxes to them? Why would you fight wars for them? Why would you regard them as your government rather than a foreign power that's occupying your home? Actually, that's pretty close to the situation that a lot of nation states find themselves in. Most modern countries are pretty recent agglomerations of territories that used to be separate, right? We mentioned last time, for example, Italy. Italy's only been a country, single country, since 1861. Before that, it was composed of a whole bunch of independent states that spoke a lot of different languages and had very different cultures. Now, not all states that start out this way hold together. You can think of some of the ones that fell apart relatively recently in Eastern Europe, like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and really the Soviet Union. Now, facing a situation like that, leaders of states have to find a way of pulling all these different groups of people together, making them feel like they're one group, a nation. They have to make this brand new, just invented political unit feel like a basic part of people's experience. In other words, they have to make it authentic. And to do that, they appeal to nationalism. If you can make people feel like they have an authentic national identity, if you can give them a sense that their identities as Italians or Yugoslavs or Americans is a basic part of who they are, then they'll have a reason to pay your taxes and fight your wars. I don't want to make this sound Machiavellian, like it's some sort of evil conspiracy, because it isn't. It's a very concrete, practical problem that the leaders of modern nation states face. To bind people to their nation, they have to make it seem authentic, even if, historically, it's obviously not. Well, how do you do that? Well, to make the nation authentic, it has to have some of the things that we associate with authentic communities. It should have its own folk traditions, for example, dances, costumes, holidays, rituals. It should have its own language that everybody speaks. If you have a special connection to the land where it's located, that's great. It should have its own special cultural values and archetypes. Now, the problem, of course, is that modern agglomerated states very often don't have any of that. So what do? Well, you do what people always do in that situation. You make it up. Folk traditions, for example. Back in the 19th century, nationalists in Scotland were trying to break away from England. And they felt that they needed a common culture that could unite the Scots. The problem was they didn't really have one. The Scots were actually composed of a lot of different local groups, and they didn't have that much in the way of colorful traditions. So the nationalists made them up, right? Kilts, for example, were a very recent invention at the time. Mel Gibson looked really terrific in his kilt in Braveheart, but the real William Wallace never wore one because they were actually invented by an English factory owner in the 19th century. Likewise, the idea that every Scottish clan has its own tartan plaid wasn't true either, right? The definitive book on the tartans of Scotland was written and pretty much made up by a pair of young men who were trying to establish their own claim to the Scottish throne if ever the country got its independence. Most of what we think of as the Scottish Highland tradition came about that way. Nationalists needed a tradition, so they essentially made one up. This kind of motivation has generated a lot of scholarship, too. In the 1700s, nationalists in Germany based a lot of their arguments for a national identity on the idea of a folk spirit, a Volksgeist, that they said characterized every authentic people. What made a German, or a Dane, or a Fleming, was their connection to this authentic spirit, this Volksgeist, that was passed down to them through their culture. Now, where would you find this spirit? How would you identify it? Well, they felt that you couldn't find it in the cities anymore, because those had gotten too modernized and too cosmopolitan. If you went to Berlin or Hamburg, you found a culture that was dominated by trade and immigration and elite culture, rather than the true German spirit. To find the real spirit of the folk, you had to go out into the country. You had to look for it among peasants. If you looked at their customs, their stories, and their beliefs, you'd be able to get a sense of what authentic German culture was. Now, this was the beginning of the discipline of folklore, the study of the sort of lore of the folk. Folk is the German word for people. This is where we get things like Grimm's fairy tales. The reason that the brothers Grimm were running around the Black Forest collecting children's stories was to try to find the true spirit that animated the emerging German nation. Almost every modern country has something similar, a folklore archive that collects the everyday speech and tales and customs of the common people to try to establish that there really is a true national self. Now, in the book, Lindholm spends a little bit of time talking about dance as a route for this. Think about Cuba. Before the Cuban Revolution, for example, there were a variety of local dances on the island, and the government really didn't pay all that much attention to any of them. To the extent that the government subsidized dance at all, it was by supporting European ballet companies. After the Cuban Revolution, however, Fidel Castro wanted to establish an authentic Cuban dance as a part of the island's folk tradition, and he settled on the rumba. The State Folkloric Institute established an official rumba troupe, and they in turn established strict standards for what a rumba dance should contain. Rumba lyrics were written that exalted its place in Cuban society. As one of them put it, without rumba there is no Cuba. Without Cuba there is no rumba. They established official rumba days and national rumba contests. Now, not that many people actually dance the rumba. It's a hard dance to do, and it's especially hard to do once the state sets up official standards for how it has to be done. There is no sense in which the rumba is some universal part of the basic fabric of indigenous Cuban culture. But again, that wasn't the point. The state needed a national dance, not to give everyone a dance to do, but to create an authentic symbol, to make something that everyone could regard as the authentic physical movement that expressed true Cuban spirit. You could say very similar things for the merengue in the Dominican Republic or the tango in Argentina. What's important about them is not whether or not they're genuine, whether they're authentic indigenous dances, but whether people can think about them that way. If they can, that's really all that matters. Now, language is another important aspect of national identity, and it often has to be made up too. Israel was one of the most thoroughgoing states to do this. When the country was founded in 1848, after the Second World War, one of the many problems the leaders faced was what to speak, right? Jews had been living in a lot of different countries for the past 2,000 years, and they spoke a lot of different languages, right? Yiddish had been the most commonly spoken language, but the vast majority of the Yiddish speakers of Europe had been murdered during the Holocaust. So for the new country, the new Jewish homeland, what should be the common language? Well, they settled on Hebrew, mainly because it seemed so authentic. It was, after all, the language of the Jews of the Bible, who had lived in that same place thousands of years ago. And it was a language that all Jews were familiar with because, of course, it was the language of Jewish religious services. That created a problem, though, because while everyone knew some Hebrew, nobody spoke it in regular life. It was a liturgical language, something that you'd speak in the synagogue or during prayers, but not something that you'd use on the street. And that meant that it was missing a lot of words for essentially anything that had been invented since the writing of the Bible. There were also a lot of local variations in pronunciation, since people had been using it in synagogues from South America to East Asia. So the state had to literally invent modern Hebrew. They had to decide on proper spelling and pronunciation conventions. They had to make up hundreds and hundreds of new words, and they had to teach everyone to speak it. Their success in doing all that was one of the foundational pieces of the development of the Israeli state. There's a similar process going on, well, in a lot of places. Wales is one of them, the United Kingdom. The Welsh nationalist movement, which wants to separate from England, uses the Welsh language as its most important symbol of Welsh difference. The Welsh don't look that different from the English, after all, and they have a lot of the same cultural features, but their language is pretty distinctive. It looks like no other language I know. And it's a lovely language to hear. It's a wonderful thing. The only problem is that hardly anyone speaks it anymore. Most people in Wales, including most Welsh nationalists, speak English as their primary language. You have to go to some pretty remote villages in the highlands of the country to find more than a handful of people who speak Welsh in daily life. So the nationalists in Wales have been working frantically to rebuild the language, instituting mandatory Welsh education, demanding that street signs be posted in Welsh, awarding prizes for towns and villages that have a high percentage of Welsh speakers, and so on. Now, it hasn't been terribly successful in propagating the language. These movements very rarely are. But the need for an authentic language as a basis for authentic nationhood is so powerful that people don't want to give it up. Now, the other thing we mentioned can also be made up. And Lundholm talks about how this can be done. Land, for example. The French, for example, have this mystical notion of a terroir that underlies their cuisine. This idea that there is a special relationship between the soil and the air and the people of France that gives a special quality to grapes grown in Burgundy or cheese made in Camembert. Cultural images of the self, too, can be invented. Again, think about Israel. After the Second World War and the founding of the State of Israel, they also needed to generate a new image of Jews, right? The old ones were very painful. And they needed some new authentic Jewish image that would be unique to the new country and the entirely different cultural pattern they had tried to set up. And what they came up with was the Sabra, a tough, no-nonsense cowboy warrior, epitomized by General Moshe Dayan. Someone who didn't care about uniforms or manners or snooty culture. The Sabra ideal was something that was cultivated especially in the Israeli military, and over time, it has become cemented in the culture as the authentic Israeli Jew, one distinct from Jews in other places. Now, with all these techniques, states create the idea of the nation, something that's incorporated into the individual self to bind people to the new entity. They create the idea that there exists a group of people who are really, genuinely, authentically French or German or Italian or even American. Now, of course, it doesn't cover everyone. There are going to be people who don't speak this new language or dance this new dance, or who for one reason or another don't match this model of the true citizen. And those people can be in for a pretty tough time. Because, of course, if the nation is composed of all these people with a common heritage, and if that nation is associated with a particular territory, what do you do with the people who aren't part of it? What are they doing there? Their very presence becomes a threat to the integrity of this model of the nation. Now, this works out particularly badly when notions of race are mixed in with this. Germany, of course, during the Nazi period, declared that the German race was something infinitely superior to other races, and they expelled or killed millions and millions of people who weren't part of the group. Now, the Nazis carried this especially far, but you can find it all over the world. In France, for example, ultranationalists like Jean and Marine Le Pen have demanded French for the French, saying that only people with true French blood should be able to live in France. In Italy, Lombard nationalists in the Northern League have made similar claims about the importance of the purity of the North Italian people. Now, assertions like this have led to some appalling crimes in recent years, including bloody ethnic cleansing in places like Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. Those events are one of the reasons that many anthropologists, including me, have been very troubled by the tenor of nationalist political discourse in the United States in recent years, as people have increasingly talked about Americans and immigrants and outsiders in ways that have led to some very dark places in other countries. One of the greatest dangers of the hunger for authenticity is the tendency it carries to disenfranchise those who don't seem to have it, and to demonize those people who seem to threaten our own authenticity. Those processes can spiral out of control very quickly. And so discourses about nationalism are something that we always need to watch very, very carefully.